everyone. Tonight, the Jefferson Literary Debating Society, now in its 187th year of continuous existence, is both very pleased and very proud to present the third speaker in our weekly speaker series for the fall 2012 semester, Professor Garret Sheldon. Professor Sheldon will present a speech entitled The Conservative Jefferson. You'll be pleased to know that we have a true Jeffersonian speaking for us tonight. Dr. Sheldon's dissertation at Rutgers University was entitled Classical and Modern Influences on American Political Thought, The Political Theories of Thomas Jefferson. He's also written extensively about Jefferson. While I don't have time to name every book, article, and chapter, a few of his books include Jefferson and Ataturk, Political Philosophies, Religion and Political Culture in Jefferson's Virginia, What Would Jefferson Say?, and The Political Philosophy of Thomas Jefferson. Professor Sheldon has served as Morton Beaty Professor of Political Science at UVA at Wise since 1997. The Jefferson Society is proud to host such a distinguished speaker. Without any further ado, please stand and join me in welcoming Professor Sheldon.
Thank you so much for that kind and generous introduction. It's, of course, a great honor to be here, and I'm very grateful for the invitation. My talk is entitled The Conservative Jefferson. Our founder of this university and the founder of our country. He was a great philosopher, of great breadth. He didn't just write on politics, but on family, manners, leadership, health, art, science, and religion. Jefferson was considered a radical in his own time, but by today's standards, you'll see he sounds rather conservative. At least a cultural conservative. As my friend here at UVA, James Hunter, the author of Culture Wars, I've been told that that's good. At the University of Vienna in Austria, they do this. And I kept saying, "Come in!" That was their form of applause. Now, we might say that Jefferson's ideas were time-bound, coming out of the 18th century. It would be different today. But Jefferson saw most of these ideas as perennial, for all time, reflecting a stable human nature, ethics, and God. He was what we in philosophy would call in the natural law tradition. From Aristotle through St. Thomas Aquinas and Locke, that natural law tradition that says there is an objective natural law that may be different even from our own preferences. So this talk I'm giving tonight, that will be a short talk. I really would like to have more of a discussion than a lecture. That comes out of portions of my book, What Would Jefferson Say?, which is now out of print, but I will sell you my copy for $5,000. Or you can buy it on Amazon used for anywhere from 1 to 3 cents. $5 shipping. But I want to look at a few of the subjects. This book actually came out of a student's comment, the source of all wisdom. Students' comments. It was an American Political Thought seminar. We were looking at the founders, and Joe Carrico, who's now a judge, said, "You know, I like studying all these historical ideas, but I'm curious as to what they would think about today, the issues today." And that gave me the idea of this book, and looking at his writings and some of his quotes and relating them to issues in our time. The first from a chapter on religion and morality. Jefferson was, as one scholar wrote, a pious and regular church attender who wrote very harsh criticisms of religion. Many religious people at his time called him an atheist or an infidel, but he had a deep and abiding faith in God. Jefferson was raised in the established or official Church of England in colonial Virginia, known as the Anglican Church, now the Episcopal Church, which even then was known for its sophisticated and worldly qualities. And I speak as someone brought up in that church. The beauty and dignity of its liturgy, the sacred music, church architecture gave Anglicanism an aristocratic flavor. Its elegance and well-educated clergy made it the religion of the gentleman. Or as one wag put it, the Anglican Church is the house of lords in prayer. But Jefferson was an avid student of the Bible all his life, and his writings are salted with scriptural allusions and quotations. A clergyman who rode with Jefferson on a long journey in a coach and not knowing his identity found Jefferson's discussion of religion and knowledge of religion so learned that he was sure Jefferson was a clergyman. One of Jefferson's earliest recollections was of being called upon as a boy to recite the Lord's Prayer before guests at dinner. Probably would turn him off to religion at that point. Jefferson remembered his mother teaching him his prayers and his favorite sister Jane teaching him to sing the Psalms. As an adult, Jefferson usually read his compilation of the Bible before going to bed every night. He wrote, "I never go to bed without an hour's reading of something moral whereon to ruminate in the intervals of sleep." By this he meant the Gospels of Jesus. Once, when tragic death struck his family, he was found alone in his room clutching the Bible. And as he was dying, Jefferson uttered words like those of Simeon, "Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace." So religious ethics, or what he called a moral sense, to him was in human nature and was strengthened through practice. Jefferson advised his nephew to be, quote, "good, learned, and industrious," which he said would make him precious to your country, dear to your friends, and happy within yourself. Quite moralistic. Jefferson encouraged the presence of religious institutions here at the University of Virginia, saying it was not to be understood that instruction in religious opinion and duties was meant to be precluded by the public authorities. On the contrary, the relations which exist between man and his Maker are the most interesting and important to every human being. Thomas Jefferson's personal life displayed many of his ethical beliefs. He summed up his moral system as to be grateful, to be faithful, to be open and generous. And he lived those principles. His granddaughter remarked on the scrupulous fidelity with which he discharged the duties of every relation in life. And friends testified to his kindness, generosity, and forbearance. So one of the reasons Mr. Jefferson was so focused on his family and on what we used to call family values. He believed in a traditional family. While he was married, Jefferson was a loving, faithful, and devoted husband, and a caring and indulgent father to his daughters, which gives me a certain comfort. A great-granddaughter wrote of Jefferson's, quote, "beautiful domestic character, especially the warmth of his affections." Jefferson frequently expressed his love for his children and grandchildren. He invented and played games with them and indulged them with frequent surprises and gifts. His granddaughter, Ellen, once wrote, "My Bible came from him, my Shakespeare, my first writing table, my first silk dress." As President Jefferson wrote his daughter from Washington of the desire of being at home once more, of exchanging labor, envy, and malice. He was in Washington, D.C. Exchanging labor, envy, and malice for ease, domestic occupation, and domestic love. A granddaughter described Jefferson as his cheerfulness and affection was the warm sun in which his family all basked. His generosity was legendary. An 8-year-old granddaughter, Cornelia, saw another girl's beautiful dress and went up the stairs crying, "I never had a silk dress in my life." The next day, a package arrived from Charlottesville containing a silk dress for Cornelia. Another granddaughter remembered wanting a handsome equipment for her horse, riding kit. "I was standing one bright day," she wrote, "on the portico, Monticello, when a man rode up with a beautiful lady's saddle and bridle. My heart bounded. These coveted articles were deposited at my feet. My grandfather came out of his room to tell me they were mine." Jefferson loved children, and he opposed abortion. When he revised the Code of Virginia, he included retaining the category of murder called sadicide, which is Latin for murder of the seed. In his relations with women, and I beg you not to ask a question about his history. It's always the first question, and I always say, there are some things gentlemen don't talk about. This is probably another one. But Jefferson wrote this. He said, "Women are formed by nature for attentions." It means giving attention. Caring for, not for hard labor. Jefferson wrote, "A woman never forgets one of the numerous train of little offices which belong to her. A man forgets often." and he'd never even been to my house. It's an amazing thing. I really thought he was writing about me, but then I saw the date was 1787, so he couldn't. Writing about the Sheldon home. But please, this is a little controversial, so I ask you to sit down. Jefferson believed that men and women are different. I know, it's unbelievable. Jefferson believed, I mean, how old-fashioned can you get, that men and women possess different sensibilities, attitudes, and gifts. See? See? That's probably the ghost of Mr. Jefferson. And for Jefferson and people like him, the differences are not bad. They can complement each other and produce a rich harmony, not just a source of conflict or inequality. Appreciating the sex's different temperaments can be a joy, not a burden for Jefferson. Jefferson's main experience with women was his wife, Martha, or Patty, recorded as a pretty, petite, vivacious young woman. She was known for her accomplishments at the feminine talents of music and dance. Family recollections portray Patty Jefferson as exquisitely beautiful, tall, with a lithe figure, graceful, attractive, and she was very well educated for her day, and a voracious Jefferson had the common 18th century gentry's attitude towards the fairer sex. Women should not work or go into politics or fight in wars, but be married, have children, and run the home. He criticized Native Americans for having their women do all the hard manual labor. I promise I'll offend equally. I was told that this society, anything goes. He said that this practice, force is law. The stronger sex imposes on the weaker. It is civilization alone which replaces women in the enjoyment of their natural equality. Writing to his newlywed daughter, Jefferson advised, "Be you, my dear, the link of love, union, and peace for the whole family. The happiness of your life," he wrote to his daughter Martha, "depends now on continuing to please a single person. Wives," he wrote, "should not themselves engage in loud political fever, but rather be contented to soothe and calm the minds of their husbands, returning ruffled from political debate." Moving on to a more neutral subject. This was written, published around the year 2000 when drugs was a big issue. And Jefferson did talk about drugs. He wrote once, "Infants, maniacs, gamblers, and drunkards." Infants, maniacs, gamblers, and drunkards require restrictive measures to save them from destroying their health, morals, family, and usefulness to society. That's infants, maniacs, gamblers, and drunkards. The main drugs in Jefferson's time were tobacco and alcohol, both of which he produced. But hardly ever used. I recall speaking at Montpelier, Mr. Madison's home, and the guide was saying that in his retirement, he would meet there in the dining room with all his cronies, and the cigar smoke got so thick that Dolly and her women friends would move to another room upstairs. And I said, "Are you saying that James Madison smoked cigars?" And she said, "Well, this was a tobacco plantation." Anyway, he believed that hard liquor had a loathsome and fatal effect on human behavior and health. He would drink 2 or 3 glasses of wine at dinner, but he said half its effects by drinking weak wines only. Jefferson despised the effects of whiskey destroying fortunes, bodies, minds, and morals of its citizens. He talked about its loathsome effects of whiskey. But he also wrote on public health, on healthcare. And he was what we might today call a sort of holistic or naturalistic health person. He said once, "Nature and kind nursing save a much greater proportion at a smaller expense and with less abuse." Speaking of healthcare systems, he said, "Nature and kind nursing save a much greater proportion at a smaller expense." But Mr. Jefferson had very little personal illness. He was blessed with a remarkably good health all his life, right up to a few weeks before his death at age 83. He shared the common 18th century suspicion of doctors, joking that he always knew when a physician was visiting the neighborhood because vultures began circling above in the air. He claimed that the sun was his great physician. Being outdoors in the fresh air, he believed in what today we would call holistic medicine, integrating physical and emotional and spiritual. Like the Native Americans, he admired in many ways, emphasizing the healing power of nature, our body's natural defenses and recuperative abilities. He attributed his own health to healthy habits, a diet consisting of little meat or fat, abstinence from tobacco and alcohol, lots of vegetables, regular exercise, walking, or on horseback. Walking for him was the best exercise. Walking around in the countryside here. He said 2 hours a day, in all weather. And he said you walk to relax and meditate. So he said don't take a book. Don't take any distractions. He said just carry a gun. Just take your gun with you. On the subject of manners, Mr. Jefferson was reputed to be a very gracious, very cultivated gentleman, very civilized, refined. And he said once, in truth, politeness is artificial good humor. It is the practice of sacrificing to those whom we meet in society all the little conveniences and preferences which will gratify them, what we would call courteous, gracious. It is giving a pleasant and flattering turn to our expressions, which will conciliate others and make them pleased with us as well as themselves. How cheap a price for the goodwill of another. To be polite, to be courteous. Mr. Jefferson preached that. And in his personal relations, Jefferson was the consummate gentleman, courteous, gracious, urbane. Henry Adams wrote of Jefferson, his character could not be denied elevation, versatility, breadth, insight, delicacy. His tastes were, for that day, exceedingly refined. His instincts were those of a liberal European nobleman. Jefferson's grandson told many stories of his polished manners, of a well-bred gentleman, courteous and considerate of all persons. Jefferson once chastised his grandson for refusing to return the courteous bow of a black man. On another occasion, as President Jefferson was riding back to Monticello on his favorite horse, accompanied by dinner guests. On reaching a stream, a poor man asked Mr. Jefferson if he would carry him across on his horse, and Jefferson consented. Afterwards, a guest who was riding with them asked the man why he'd asked Jefferson for the ride. The poor man replied, "From the others' looks, I did not like to ask them. The old gentleman looked as if he would do it, so I asked him." One of Jefferson's prudential rules, as he called it, rules of prudence in social life, was to never enter into dispute or argument with another. He claimed that he never saw an instance of two disputants convincing each other by argument, but he had often seen them, he said, on getting warm, becoming rude, and shooting one another. Rather than arguing with others, Jefferson advised asking questions, as if for information, suggesting doubts, but never directly arguing with someone. Sort of Socratic method. The method of Socrates, asking questions, letting the person learn themselves if they were in error, but knowing that, if you confront them sometimes, they'll simply become more stubborn and more set in their views. That's why Jefferson seemed to be very open and liberal in the liberal arts sense of liberal, always interested in what other people thought, questioning, suggesting alternatives. And his relation to James Madison is very much like that. They both have that kind of Socratic dialogue all the time. Finally, here at Mr. Jefferson's University, we should look at his vision of education. He said, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. Jefferson was educated privately, but he believed in public education in America. It was necessary to avoid tyranny, strengthen democracy, and provide equal opportunity. He said, enlighten the people generally, and tyranny and oppressions of body and mind will vanish like spirits at the dawn of day. Jefferson, you know, himself received private education, common to the 18th century Virginia gentry class. He studied with a tutor, an Anglican clergyman, attended college at William and Mary, and read the law under George Will. His education was strictly classical, Latin, Greek, modern languages, great literature, the ancient philosophers, Greek and Roman, the Judeo-Christian religious traditions, and science and mathematics, what he called natural philosophy. His advocacy of a public system of education in Virginia did not diminish his love of traditional learning. Instead, he simply wanted to give the advantages of classical education to all, as he said, regardless of wealth, birth, or other accidental conditions. And you'll all, as students here at Mr. Jefferson's University, I know, appreciate the advice he gave to students. Soon after completing his own legal training, Jefferson was asked by a younger man to mentor him. He gave the new law student a rigorous regimen of study, displaying his own Catholic approach to learning, universal approach. Throughout, he recommended commonplacing one's studies, or writing out in a separate notebook or journal the quotes from authors that the student found most interesting. When I did my dissertation on Jefferson, I used his commonplace book, which was then in Princeton, and it was fascinating to read his comments. He would quote Aristotle and then make comments on it, or Locke. I mean, it really was invaluable to have that kind of a commonplace quote. And the daily regimen he advised to this young law student was from dawn to 8 a.m., study the physical sciences, ethics, and religion. From 8 o'clock to noon, he says, the best hours of the day. Study the black letter of the law, classic texts, Magna Carta, English statutes, Bracton, Lord Kames, Sir Edwin Coke. From noon to 1, read politics, Locke, Sidney. In the afternoon, ancient and modern history. In the evening, literature, literary criticism, rhetoric, and oratory. Apparently Jefferson didn't prescribe any time for meetings. But here at the University of Virginia, the classics form the foundation of the curriculum. He divided it into these areas: ancient languages, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, mathematics, physics, natural philosophy, natural history, medicine, law and ideology, what we call political theory, government. He sought for a faculty from the finest European universities, a classicist from Oxford, a mathematician from Cambridge, an anatomist from Edinburgh, and modern language scholars from the continent. But the most significant import was the free spirit of inquiry at the University of Virginia. This institution, he wrote, will be based on the illimitable freedom of the human mind. For here we are not afraid to follow truth, wherever it might lead, nor to tolerate any error, so long as reason is left free to combat it. That standard of academic freedom and inquiry, as you know here, is literally carved in stone. one of the things that makes this university and the best in American higher education distinctive from any other country in the world. And this Jefferson Society of yours preserves that educational ideal of reasoned discourse. So you are conservative too. Thank you. Any questions or answers? Yes, sir.
Professor, first of all, thank you so much for coming to us tonight. It was a wonderful speech. My question actually is, you talked first about sort of the idea of these modern political conflicts and how you would apply Jefferson's thinking to them. It seems like we have a lot of debates between sort of like personal liberty and then sort of like the state taking action. How do you see Jefferson's conception of personal liberty as playing into these sorts of like policy decisions?
Well, it does very much. I'll give you an example, which is dear to my heart as a political theorist, and I also teach political theology, and I'm a minister, an ordained Christian minister. And one of the things that's most important in terms of liberty, of course, for Jefferson is liberty of religion, freedom of religion. And by that, he meant, Madison meant, that the state does not interfere with the church, does not force the church to do things that are contrary to its faith. That's persecution of religion, that's persecution of the church. To require the Catholic Church, by law, to support things that they regard as mortal sins is a clear case of violation of religious liberty as Mr. Jefferson understood it. I'll add that I don't think he was an Orthodox Christian. He may have been raised Anglican, but I think the evidence is, unless we know his last moments before death, and none of us do know them, he was a Unitarian. He was not a Christian. He didn't believe in the basic tenets of the Christian creed or faith, the divinity of Christ, original sin, redemption through the cross, the atonement. So he was a Unitarian, believed in God, but sort of one God. Saw Jesus as a moral teacher, ethical teacher. So he didn't make this argument for religious freedom from a Christian viewpoint. James Madison did. And the argument comes out of his largely Reformed Presbyterian view of liberty of conscience. The idea that God gives us liberty of conscience, and you cannot force faith on them. You can't force people to believe it. Unless it's voluntary, faith doesn't mean anything. It doesn't impress God. And it certainly doesn't impress other people. So, but they actually believed, particularly Madison, both Jefferson and Madison, that free expression and practice, what the Constitution in the First Amendment calls it, free exercise of religion. It's not just belief, it's exercise, practicing religion, and not having the state force you to do something contrary to your practice. That kind of freedom, freedom to believe, not believe, switch denominations, switch faiths, was actually, for Madison and other evangelicals, the best way for the gospel to be spread. The best way, and they believe sort of like, the debate that occurs here at the university, that it's actually healthy to have a free marketplace of religious debate, a confident citizenry who isn't afraid to be questioned or discuss their faith. I mean, if you can't defend it, what does it mean? And they really believe that out of that sort of, Jefferson believed that out of that sort of debate, freedom of religion, you would distill, he thought, Christian ethics. What every denomination of the church believed was should have a sermon on the Mount. What Madison believed was that everybody would become Calvinists. Well, those whom God preordained to become Calvinists. And of course, liberty, of course, extends for Jefferson to economic liberty. He clearly believed in a free market kind of system when he said at the inauguration of his first presidency, what we want is a wise and frugal government. He's talking about the federal government being wise and frugal, not overtaxing the labor of the citizen. Most of what would be done would be at the state level in terms of welfare, education, and so on. The central government for Jefferson would deal primarily with international affairs, military, defense, negotiating, and so on. And so, he really, I think, believed in, as John Locke did, that these liberties, these individual rights to life, liberty, and property are all connected. That you can't restrict some and keep the others. If you don't have economic freedom, you're not going to have political freedom, which is democracy, rule of law, elections, and you won't have religious freedom, liberty of conscience, freedom to express your faith. You won't have freedom of press, you won't have freedom of speech, you won't have academic freedom. They're all of a piece. You can't start restricting some of them and expect the others to survive. The American system was designed to allow a great deal of individual freedom, and the idea was that there would be abuse, there would be ridiculous things said, horrible things said in the press, lunatic cults. But as long as they didn't violate law, secular law, you have to tolerate that. And it's sort of the idea, Jefferson would love the internet. How Jefferson would love the internet. The whole world, and the kind of debate and blogs and comments. The reason I love reading articles on the web isn't the articles, it's the comments. People have been much smarter and certainly funnier than the article. And the debate that occurs, that's just what Jefferson hoped for in American democracy. Citizens, do you know, I've traveled all over the world, I've lectured all over the world. There is not another country on earth in the history of the earth, except possibly ancient Athens, where average citizens, average Americans are discussing economic philosophy and arguing about what causes economic growth and development. What is the role of the government? What is the effect of this policy? Average Americans are arguing this stuff. It wouldn't happen, I can tell you, it wouldn't happen in England. They leave that to Parliament. That's their job. We just go about our work. The state does that. So, all of those liberties are of a piece, and it puts a great responsibility on individuals. The idea is that they're mature, democratic citizens, confident, self-confident. So they're not offended by someone who disagrees with them. They don't burn down your building if you offend them. That is not natural in the sense of human nature. Throughout the history of humanity, it is not natural for you, holding strong views, to sit in the same room and discuss without killing someone who disagrees strongly with your held view. That doesn't come naturally. What comes naturally is killing them. And whoever does the most killing wins, and their view wins. So what we're talking about here in Jefferson and John Stuart Mill on liberty and our traditions of American liberty is really quite extraordinary. It seems simple to us because we grew up with it. But believe me, in the rest of the world, it's exceedingly rare. So yeah, I think that was a terribly important part of it. The sanctity of the individual, the freedom of the individual both develops the individual in an Aristotelian sense, Aristotelian teleological sense, and is the best to develop society. You produce the most productive, the most intelligent, the most interesting, society when you have a group of strong individuals who enjoy liberty and the responsibility that comes with it. Yes?
First, Professor Sheldon, thank you very much for coming and speaking tonight. I was hoping that as an educator and as a Jefferson scholar, you could speak to what Jefferson might have thought of the model of education that's now prevalent in this country and even here at the University of Virginia. It differs starkly from the classical liberal model of education that Jefferson prescribed and that he was taught under himself. I hope you could speak to that.
Yeah, I don't want to sound like a complete reactionary or make Jefferson into Edmund Burke. But because he does love technology, he loves inventions, he loves new things. But what I'm saying is he has a natural law philosopher's conception of the perennial truth from the great thinkers. He is Burkean in that sense. From Shakespeare, from Aristotle, from Locke, from Jesus. And those things are to be taught both to civilized people, and he would say, even if you're going to be a good revolutionary, he's a revolutionary, he's a pretty radical guy. And he would say the best revolutionaries understand the classics, understand human nature as we've understood it for 3,000 years in the West. And their systems will continue. Whereas the ones who are just revolutionary on some cause or some very narrow ideological perspective, those revolutions tend not to take. French Revolution, Russian Revolution, Puritan Revolution in England. After 10 years of Cromwell, all the English, including the Puritans, said, "Bring back the king, please. Where's Charles II? Could we get him back?" Monarchy, and they didn't mean just the restoration of the monarch, they meant the restoration of England, the restoration of the traditional English constitution. Culture based on order and deference and all sorts of things, ceremony, tradition. So I think not only would he value the classics, but he would see them as the way to doing things that are progressive, but doing them well. Again, he wouldn't deny me he'd love to see inventions and the internet and technological change. But that doesn't affect our nature. That doesn't change. You can see his examples. He sees human nature as pretty fixed across history. We have different tools, different techniques, habits. It's very much the way that St. Thomas Aquinas portrays divine law, natural law, and human law. Human law changes fairly quickly. Natural law, almost not at all. Divine law never changes. So the key is to make human law conform with natural law and divine law, or it won't work in that Aristotelian sense of what's more inclusive. And I think Jefferson would say the same thing, that to be really advanced is not to throw out the classics, as I told one of the psychology professors in my department. By the way, Mr. Jefferson, I teach in the social science department, which includes political science, sociology, psychology, and administration of justice, and anthropology. And at one point we were discussing to change the name of the department. I said, well, we're part of the University of Virginia, let's use Jefferson's name for the social science. Do you know what it is? It's actually for psychology. He said, we need to have a field, let's do with the human mind and emotions and behavior and so on. And he said, what we should call it is the field of moral zoology. So I propose that we change the name of our department to the Department of Moral Zoology. Fortunately, I had tenure at the time. And an endowed chair. But I was talking to a psychologist in my department once. He said, "Oh, Garret, you've got to read this new book. It's a guy in California." Immediately suspect. I said, "Well, what's the thesis?" He says, "Well, he thinks that truth and like healthy behavior and ethics all has to do with being moderate, being between extremes." I said, "That sounds a little bit like Aristotle, doesn't it?" It's a little bit like the Nicomachean Ethics, doesn't it? The Golden Mean. He said, "Well, I didn't say it was original." If you could hear the things professors say to each other. But anyway, that's the point. I think, there are some new things, but most of it really has been said, and if we don't teach that, we're going to go off thinking that we just developed a new theory that Aristotle discovered 2,200 years ago. That's my humble opinion. Yes, sir.
Professor, I'd just like to say thank you again for coming tonight. Looking back at Jefferson, obviously everyone would attend to you, he has a great level of respect for this man. He said that even further to the members of the Jefferson Society. We look back, with the Declaration of Independence, and as he's doing this, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he changes the last word from property, so that previous generations may not use this as like a justification for slavery and things like that. We were extensively in his summer review against the transgressions of the King George III, against the liberties of the colonials, not treating them as equals and things like that. We look back at this great man, great philosopher, spoke much about freedom and kind of leads to our laws that we have today. But with this huge character flaw of owning slaves, through what lens should we kind of look back and remember that aspect of his life? And if you'd like to extend it even more, for my personal benefit as a black male attending this university and being a member of the Jefferson Society, how I should view him in this regard.
Would you please repeat that question? That's an easy one. I'm glad you asked that easy question. And I'll try to answer it. I do believe the explanation is one both of awkwardness and hypocrisy. He wrote that he knew how terrible slavery was, that it was unjust. He said when he contemplated that God is just, he trembled that he owned slaves, because he knew it was unjust, and that God wouldn't allow it to last forever. So he knew slavery was wrong. On the other hand, he was, I don't think just his character, but he was in a system where, though he tried to get hired workers, he tried to bring in workers from Europe, Italian peasants, and others to replace Germans, to replace the slaves. He never succeeded. And so this is where the hypocrisy comes. I mean, he clearly wasn't going to give up his standard of living or his moral concerns about owning slaves. So it's obviously a quandary. As you know, in the summary review, he also has what today we would call racist views of the slaves. He says, I hope that upon being liberated, the negative qualities of the blacks I witnessed is due to their enslavement. But he said, I'm not sure. And he had some very negative things to say about black. He said, as far as he could see, all the sort of stereotypes. They weren't as thoughtful, they were lazy, after working in the hot fields for only 14 hours a day, they slept a lot. And he, that's why he and Madison believed in gradual emancipation. Madison had a plan to use the revenue from the sale of Western lands to buy slaves and then to repatriate them to Africa. Because he believed the tension, the conflict would always exist after slavery between whites and blacks in America. He said it would be a continued kind of war. So clearly this is difficult to issue for Jefferson and for us. I guess I would ask, what would Jonathan Edwards say? Actually, Jonathan Edwards did say this. You know, the Puritan theologian, greatest theologian of the 18th century in America. He said, slavery is an evil. It's an evil we're living with. It's an evil we're trying to overcome. And as a sort of Calvinist Christian, you say, and we're always living in evil. This is a fallen world, a wicked world. We can't pretend it isn't. Whether we own slaves or not, somehow we're implicated in that slave system. Whether we pay people 50 cents a week, or we buy things from China where they have slave labor, we're all implicated. Our lives, every one of us, is implicated in evil and injustice. That doesn't mean we shouldn't work on it. But Edwards said, for a Christian, you work on it in where you can be effective in your immediate circle. Your obligations to family and friends and work and school or church or community, or that's where you can make a difference. And sometimes reformers who are saving the world or the earth are neglecting their own immediate obligations to their families, friends, children. And so, you know, I think for Jefferson, as for Jonathan Edwards, it's part of the tragic human condition that we're all implicated in the fall, in sin. There is no one who is good, not one. And that's part of the reality of life, and why life involves suffering, and always will. So the thing to address is where in my sphere, which perhaps for Jefferson, as for Washington, was the freedom. But even then, he would be implicated in a system of that, or capitalism, or communism, or some system that you're a part of. You can't change yourself. You can't change yourself. That's a good place to start. As I tell people in the church, when you've completely cleaned up your own act, then clean up mine. Then go out and save somebody else. But honestly, examine yourself. That's when I really start wagging my finger in the Bible. You miserable sinners. What do you deserve? You're not getting what you deserve. What you deserve is damnation. So I know that's a long answer to a difficult question, but you know, I really think it's a good question because it highlights the evil so clearly. It's so easy to cover up other things: what we're buying, what we're eating, where we're working, our nation's trade, our own education. I mean, if you want to find injustice, you don't have to look very far. We're blind to most of it. We're blind to most of what we're doing that's unjust, uncharitable, unkind, unloving, irresponsible. And so, I would say, think globally and reform globally. Any other questions? Yes.
Professor, thank you so much for being here tonight. And in your speech, you mentioned to a great extent on Jefferson's opinion on women. So I'm wondering, let's suppose that Jefferson's wife is sort of like Hillary Clinton, and would he support her wife? Will he support her wife to run for the 5th president of America? Like what Bill Clinton did?
Oh dear. I was warned about this. tell you what I think Jefferson, where he's coming from, and I realize seems to be dated. But, I mean, he was raised in faith and in the tradition of the views in both classical philosophy, Aristotle, and the Bible, on the nature and relations of men and women, about which I know nothing. But I've heard that God made men and women different, Adam and Eve different, to complement each other. And that's good. It's also difficult. But he really believed, as you saw in his letters to his daughters, and in his own relationship with his wife, which of course then culturally, that was pretty much all a woman could do, was come home, stay home, look after her husband and children, and be a beautiful housewife and mother. And that was an important part of society. It was needed. And I'm sure he was familiar with the scriptures on the fall and what curses were put on men and women were different. The curse put on Adam was to earn his bread by the sweat of his brow. So the curse on men is we have to work. We have to go out and work. Bring home the baby. The curse on women, besides pain in childbirth, is the Bible says, your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. And you could say to women, God's stating a fact. Remember, we don't stone people in our culture. God is stating a fact. He says, after the fall, for whatever reason best known to the Almighty, women desire their man and desire his approval, desire to be loved by him, and to please him. And that is how he rules over her. It's a psychological, it's an emotional. And the New Testament says that men, Christian men, are to honor that with loving, the Bible says with Jesus, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. So a Christian husband is supposed to know, and I say this to couples who are married in my church, I say, you realize what's expected of you in the faith. So if you don't, this isn't going to work. And I say to the husbands in particular, are you prepared to sacrifice for your wife? Are you prepared to love your wife as Christ loved the church and gave his life for it? Died, was crucified. Husbands are to die to self, or to sacrifice their desires, their whims, their interests to the wives they love. And that overcomes the curse. So I think that's how Jefferson saw it, and he had an unusually happy marriage, of all reports, very harmonious, and she took great pleasure in his public prominence. She was proud of him, she supported him, and I won't speak for the women in this room, especially since I'm about to escape out that door. But as I look at young women, and my daughter's 23, I just had lunch with her on the way up in Christiansburg. And and the young women in my college, many of whom long for this kind of relationship with a man. A man who loves and cherishes them and protects them and provides for them. They may want to work, but also be able to be at home, particularly when the children are small. And what we've had in our society is a breakdown of both those roles. Irresponsibility on the part of the men, and perhaps, well, Ephesians says, wives respect your husband. Wives respect your husband. Doesn't mean you can't disagree with him. Wives, do not ridicule your husband in public, do not humiliate him. Those are the things that break up a marriage. And I think what Jefferson had was that kind of wonderful, by chance, I estimate 3% of married people are happy, are actually happy. Many of them just stay together because it's against the faith to divorce. It becomes a kind of working partnership. It's like a business. It's not really loving marriage. And I think Jefferson had that. That's why he was so torn apart when his young wife died. She died in childbirth in her 30s. He never remarried. We won't discuss what happened downstairs. But I think he really believed that men and women need that. And he'd experienced it. And that was good for them and for society. And nobody would even dare mention that. If I wasn't in the Jefferson Society, I wouldn't dare. If I stood up at a faculty meeting, try this sometime. I stood up and said, well, I think the major problem in our economy and in our country isn't the economy. It's not racial strife, terrorism. I think we need to get back to traditional male and female roles. Tenure, no tenure, I'm not. That is so contrary to the popular culture that it would be simply unacceptable. Right, during hate speech. And so again, you don't have to agree with it. I'm just trying to explain his perspective. I hope I'm trying to explain his perspective. As odd as it sounds, we don't know it lasted 2,500 years, but it's something to think about. I see the tragedies and the heartbreak of people, particularly young people, who don't have any sense that there might be a natural way of relating to each other. And it's higher than our preferences, it's higher than our pride. And that perhaps we should submit to that higher law. I don't know if Jefferson would say that. Other questions? Yes? Last question. Ma'am.
Professor, thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts with us tonight. In view of the fact that it should be that Jefferson held some rather racist beliefs that were by people at the time supported by the Bible, whether or not all Christians together or not, is of course another issue. Do you think it could be said that his views on feminism were similarly sexist and confined at the time and shouldn't be taken seriously today?
I am, from a contemporary viewpoint, definitely. Yeah, his views are racist and sexist. And for the same reason, which is that he believed that, perhaps only because of their enslaved condition, but perhaps not. He said, I wish I could believe, that there could be a great black mathematician and composer and writer. Of course, we've seen there are. But he said, I'm not sure. He really thought blacks and whites were different. And he really thought men and women were different. And so if that's racist and sexist, then yes, he is, by the contemporary standard of racism and sexism. Mr. Madison also was, I recently read a chapter in a book I contributed to, which I all recommend you buy, called Blackwell Companion to Madison and Monroe. It's sort of a great big book of scholarly essays on Madison and Monroe. And I wrote a chapter on Madison's Virginia resolutions against John Adams' Alien and Sedition Acts, which basically violated First Amendment freedom of speech and press. And it's really Madison's Virginia resolutions, and especially the report on the resolutions, is brilliant. You haven't read it. But there was also a chapter in this book on Madison's view on slavery. And he also was one of the founders of what was called the Colonization Society, which was to free blacks, repatriate them to Africa. And he said in Virginia, at that time, there actually were a group of freed slaves that owned land and were farmers in the center of Virginia. And he said the first generation of the freed slaves were very productive. and free and happy. He said the next generation, for whatever reason, didn't keep up the work ethic. It actually became, violent and fighting amongst themselves and addicted to alcohol and so on. And so he was racist in the sense that he doubted whether, he also felt that way about Native Americans, whether they could settle down and produce and kind of have a work ethic like the Europeans. Again, we largely disproved that. But he had a letter in Madison from tribes of Indians, Native Americans, when he was president, and they addressed it to the Great White Father. And they pleaded with Jefferson, with Madison. They said, please help us. We're poor, we're dying off, we're diseased, we freeze every winter. And he said, your tribes try to become like our 13 tribes and build strong teepees out of logs, keep out the cold, and plant and farm instead of hunting and gathering, and stop killing each other. A tremendous amount of inter-tribal warfare. So if you do that, like the 13 tribes, 13 states, you'll have peace and prosperity. So again, whether that was cultural domination or just his view of natural law that you're at a technological stage where you have to do certain things to survive, I will leave to the Jefferson Society to decide. Thank you.
Is there any reasons for the society?